Okay, so good afternoon. I'm your professor, and I'm Randy Kearns, and I'll be discussing THIRA and HVA today, and also just mention a little bit about our assignments that will be due this week. So just a couple of things. First of all, again, just a reminder, it is important to review the information that's put in the video. It's short. It won't take more than an hour of your time each week, but I do try to be sure to cover all of the key things that you need to do for the week's assignments. So let me start with there's an independent study course, IS 2001, that was scheduled to be released on the 1st of January of 2021, and it has not been released as of yet. So at this point, that assignment is no longer required. The two assignments that are required for this week, IS 139A, which is exercise design and development, and then IS 235. And let's see, IS 235 is emergency planning. Let me scroll down just a little bit to be sure that you can see the same thing I'm seeing. You also have one other assignment that's due this week. That's a short reaction paper. It's 500 to 600 words. Just again, remember APA formatting, and APA formatting is 1-inch margins, 12-point font, common font, typically Times New Roman, double space. But if you need help with the APA guide, I'll go back and put up just an outline of what an APA paper should look like. So again, 2 certificates. I don't think the third one is available. So 2 certificates are due this week and a short reaction paper. There is no online discussion this week because of the reaction paper assignment. So with that, let me go ahead and get started with the presentation. Let me stop sharing that screen and start sharing, let's see, this screen. Okay, and in doing so, okay, here we go. So again, the 2 main pieces I want to be sure and cover today, the HVA and the THIRA. Again, outside of the government world, the hazards and vulnerability analysis is more likely to be something that we'll do. If you wind up working for government at some point, the threats and hazard identification and risk assessment is what's being done now. I can tell you that there's been an evolution of that process, and it continues to morph a little bit. So in another 5 years, it may have a different name, but for now, it's THIRA for short, or Threats and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. So with that, let's be sure and talk about the key terms. Again, HVA, hazards and vulnerability analysis. We cannot control our hazards. We can control our vulnerability to those hazards. And then mitigation, what are steps that we can take to limit our exposure to a disaster, or at least help us get through the disaster a little bit easier. Sometimes it's a matter of having an alternate water source, alternate power source, things like that. SARA Title III is the Superfund Amendment Reauthorization Act that's in the Emergency Planning and Communication Right to Know Act. I'll cover those pieces a little bit later on. Extremely hazardous and dangerous substances, now referred to as EHS, threshold planning quantities, material safety data sheet, and safety data sheets, and then HAZCOM plan. So again, we'll talk about those a little bit later. For right now, I want to focus on the HVA and then move into the THIRA. So if you live or work in New Orleans, why is it important? If we look at what large communities are most likely to be threatened by natural disaster, this shows that New Orleans is actually at the top of the list for all major cities in the United States. And that's primarily because of a number of things. Number one, more than 80% or about, well, more than 50% of the city sits below sea level. And then about 80% of the city sits below flood stage of the Mississippi River. Now, we've done a great job of controlling the Mississippi River pretty much since the Bonnet-Carré Spillway was created, and that's why our last major flooding of the New Orleans area, where much of the city was substantially underwater. And I'm not talking about Katrina, that was more of a man-made disaster. But again, it does remind us that there are a lot of things that threaten our existence in the city. And so it is important for us to think through how we strengthen our position and strengthen our resolve and mitigate the damages and the dangers that are posed to us. So again, who's primarily doing the HVA? Most organizations that are not involved in government. About 2012 took a slightly different turn, and through FEMA guidance took on what's known as the THIRA approach. And that's because there wasn't a feeling that the hazard component of HVA wasn't teased out enough to understand a little bit about the difference between threats and hazards. Threats could also be certainly man-made and technological disasters. And so that was really the basis for developing the THIRA approach. And then disaster plan development in general. I've got some slides at the end. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I do want to talk specifically, at least briefly, about if you own a business or if you're involved in disaster planning for your business, what are key things that you need to think about in terms of preservation of supply chain distribution and then preservation of how you're able to continue to distribute your products. If we look at historical hazards and historical disasters, whether it was fire in the 1700s or floods substantially in the last 200 years, again, there's been substantial damage caused to the city and certainly the people that live here for a number of reasons. If we look at smallpox and yellow fever, and then the influenza pandemic, and now with the COVID pandemic, the city itself has certainly not been immune to communicable disease, infectious disease, for some of the same reasons that New Orleans was ground zero, or certainly one of the first hotspots for COVID-19. New Orleans is a international city, and probably the best way to help that kind of set home to me was 2 years ago, a travel magazine that has a fairly prominent following around the world identified Bali as the #1 tourist destination for all tourists in the world, and New Orleans is the #2 tourist destination for all tourists in the world. And while that's great for tourism, it also can make you an epicenter for a hotspot for an outbreak if there's a suddenly new emerging contagious disease. We saw it here in the 1800s, during the 19th century, when it was as much of a seaport as it was, and today it continues to be one of the busiest ports in the Western Hemisphere. But there's far better control of access and egress to the city in terms of clearing people to come into the city that have spent 3 months, 4 months on a cargo ship or a container ship coming across the ocean from other ports. But again, as we look at this list, whether it's natural disasters like Hurricane Betsy or Hurricane Katrina, or it's fires or it's floods, it does remind us that New Orleans has had some substantial disasters. And if we kind of broke it down into sections, flooding, hurricane, fire, to a much lesser extent tornado, but infectious disease primarily because it's a large international city. Maybe not so large as it once was, but it's still a substantial international city and a substantial tourist destination, as well as a shipping destination. So for hazard assessment today, we primarily use HVA again in local business and industry. I mentioned THIRA. So some organizations use something called a gap analysis. They do that with business and industry. And the whole point to a gap analysis is what do you need, what do you have, and then analyzing the gap. What's the difference between what you need and what you have, and then analyzing the cost associated with it. If you wind up working in public health, there's something called a local risk assessment. That's a variation of the HVA. And then historically, if you read something that refers to the jicama dip, that was about 20 years ago. It was the Hazard Identification and Capabilities Assessment Multi-Year Development Plan. And I only know that because I've filled out one of those each year for a number of years. But at least we don't call it something quite so complicated as a jicama dip. It's, you know, it's either an HVA or a THIRA. And then again, as far as what is an HVA, we can't control our hazards, but we can control our vulnerabilities. We can at least look for ways that we can minimize our vulnerabilities. And when you're putting together an HVA, and I've got some pieces I'll show you in just a minute in terms of how you would do an HVA, it is important to know what type of hazard or hazards and then probability of occurrence, what the impact would be on a local community, and then what's the response capability either internally in your organization or externally, people that can help you. And then prioritization, how do you prioritize this over other events? And then where do we get sources for our information? Again, whether it's public safety organizations or historical information, sometimes it's public and private partners. But again, a part of the HVA is the hazard, the natural hazard, the technological hazard, and the human-caused incidents. Again, a part of why government created the THIRA was they felt like the HVA process that existed at the time THIRA was created, which was about 10 years ago, didn't really do a good job of embracing technological hazard and human-caused incidents quite the way it does now. But HVA has also evolved to reflect the potential of those events. And so here is an HVA from a hospital system, the Kaiser Permanente hospital system out in California. Was actually the first to develop the HVA, and certainly through a number of organizations, this really became the cornerstone of disaster preparedness, at least in the civilian world, aside from government. But the point is to list all of the potential events, and then have you had any of those events, and then what's the likelihood of something like that occurring? If you're a small business, it's also important to look at other small businesses and try and get a feel for what's happened in other small businesses, so that you're not just looking specifically at your facility, but what's the risk to other similar small businesses. Now, it is important to know your geography, you know, where are you located in the floodplain compared to, you know, other small businesses you may compare to. Other parts of this, again, look at the event, the probability, the severity or the magnitude, and then subtract out the mitigation. What have you done to try and mitigate against the event? Preparedness, internal response, external response, what's available to you, and then that calculates a risk value, a risk percentage. And so here's also looking at, again, an HVA, little bit more of the calculation behind the cells. This is, if you do an HVA, they're easy to find on the web, and they're typically put together in some type of either a Google Doc or more likely in an Excel spreadsheet. And again, if it's well done, somebody's already done the weighted values on the backside of it. All you need to do is really plug and play some of the basic pieces of information. So again, if we looked at this, obviously the probability of a snowfall occurring in New Orleans is very small. The probability of an ice storm is small, although the impact would be greater, and it has occurred here from time to time. Flash flooding, much different situation. Extended rain flooding, much different situation. A tornado, enhanced Fujita of 0 to an enhanced Fujita of 2. There's some likelihood of that occurring in the New Orleans area, but again, that probability is slim. The areas more likely to be threatened by tornadoes are more toward the heartland, the plain area, Baton Rouge, North Alexandria, toward Monroe. Those parts of the state certainly are at more risk. It's not to say that can't happen. In fact, there was an EF1, I think, that touched down in New Orleans East, I don't know, within the last 10 years. So there has been tornadic activity in either the Orleans Parish or Jefferson Parish, but it's typically very small in nature, EF0, EF1, with a short lifespan. They're far more likely to be greater intensity and stay on the ground a much longer period of time as you get farther inland and away from the ocean. So adding context is also, again, realistic worst case scenario, what impact could it have, past experiences, and then again, just trying to think through how these things fit together. A part of this also includes, you know, are you managing the risk or are you taking a mitigation approach? And a mitigation approach is this, you know, you're far more likely to be at risk for a power failure if you don't have on-site backup power supply. But if you have on-site backup power supply, then you're already managing a part of your risk through a mitigation approach. And so, you know, it is important to think about how those pieces fit together. And again, the spreadsheet captures that for you. Another part of the hazard identification and risk analysis or risk assessment is this decision tree. Helps you understand a little bit more of how you would apply this information within the HVA. The bigger piece of this, though, is to understand your vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are things that we can control. You know, if you operate wholesale ice cream distribution, and a substantial amount of your product needs to be refrigerated for an extended period of time, living on the power grid in the greater New Orleans area is kind of hit and miss at times. Just where I live right now, within the last year, we've lost power 4 or 5 times. Now, it's a nuisance, but it's not catastrophic. But then again, all of my business isn't built around keeping something refrigerated for an extended period of time. If it was, I would need to be sure that I've mitigated against that vulnerability. And power loss shouldn't be a substantial vulnerability, and yet it is to at least certain businesses. And certainly in areas where the infrastructure is not ideal. And I would certainly say our infrastructure in the New Orleans area is not, it's aged and has not, there's not been a lot of investment at times. And so we have water problems at times. A lot of the water and sewer systems that are in the city are in some cases more than 100 years old. A lot of the electrical grid has been through multiple hits involving substantial hurricanes. And so again, a part of the repair was emergency repair that no one went back and updated it. So we have a lot of patchwork stuff that exists that also increases our vulnerabilities. Again, the big picture is to understand what is your business, what are things that are essential to your business, and then how do you protect those things that are essential to your business. Same thing would be said for your home. What are things that are essential to being able to stay in your home safely, and then how do you deal with that? Impact or consequence. A part of this is again just looking at the threat. What's the consequence analysis? How bad could it be? And again, whether it's loss or injury, loss of life or injury, or loss of property, how does that impact your ability to continue doing what you're doing, either as a business, or again, how can you continue to, whether you're a business or an industry, how do you continue to regain, reopen, and continue to operate effectively and efficiently? And then a part of this is prioritization of risk. What things are acceptable. Again, in my home, it's acceptable to lose power. It's not ideal. And we were without power during, I don't, maybe it was a hurricane, but we've been here less than a year. And as I said, we've lost power 4 times now. And losing power for 24, 48, 72 hours is painful. It's irritating, but it's not unsurvivable, so to speak. And yet, if I owned an ice cream business and all of my product had to have electricity, that's not an acceptable risk. And so, again, you have to weigh out the prioritization of the risk and how it affects either you or your business. And then again, thinking about the threat versus the vulnerability, and then what's the consequence, and what is, again, your level of acceptable risk, and when does it become unacceptable. And then applying the results, as I said, most HVAs include the mathematical values in the cell. So really it's plug and play. You plug in the numbers and you get an outcome that helps you understand what the results are. And then a part of this also includes how prepared are you? What type of supplies do you have? I've worked in government agencies involved in emergency management for a lot of years. And a part of that was talking to people about being prepared. Now, in some audiences, it's very easy for me to browbeat you, for me to try and convince you of the importance of being prepared. But I have to say, some of the audiences that I've spoken to, it's tough for me to talk about having 72 to 96 hours worth of food and water when some of those families, some families who live in New Orleans today, have less than 24 hours worth of food in their home because of what they can't afford. And so it is important, particularly if you work in the government sector, it's important to think about those people who would like to be prepared. They would like to have 72 to 96 hours worth of food and water available in their home. But the reality is they're not sure if they're going to be able to feed everybody in the family in the next 24 hours. So it's a little bit disingenuous to talk to everyone the same way. Understand your audience, and understand who you're trying to help. And then again, as I'm talking to you, I hope you are not in that situation. But also, I would also tell you, a part of preparing yourself includes doing things like taking a class like this. You need to understand what the risks are, and then how do you minimize your exposure to those risks. What type of equipment do you have? what you have available to you, what can you afford or what can you share with somebody else. And then certainly training and education is a key part of that. Are you a survivor, and do you know how to survive in difficult situations? And with that, let me stop the HVA process and start to talk about THIRA just a minute. Again, I just want to go over the highlights of it today. I doubt this will go the entire hour today, but I do want to be sure and again hit the highlights of these two methods of analyzing hazards and understanding risk and vulnerabilities. So the THIRA is the Threat and Hazard Identification Risk Assessment. Again, this was the government's updated version of an HVA. And so again, as we review the steps, one particular piece I want to talk about is how this relates to Presidential Policy Directive 8, PPD 8. PPD 8 has an ongoing executive order that was first issued by the president and continues to be an ongoing executive order that places an importance of mitigation and being sure that we have the capabilities to recover from disaster, respond to and recover from disaster. And a part of this is built around, do we have the means to achieve it? What is the National Preparedness System description? And then this is kind of a good view of the National Preparedness System. Again, it includes the NIM system. I think you've taken IS 700 by now. IS 700 is one's the National Response Framework, and IS 700 and IS 800 include the National Response Framework and the National Incident Management System, NIMS. And both of those feed into what's referred to as the whole community. And the whole community is a concept of being sure from a government standpoint, what are we doing for the whole community? And that includes targeting specifically underserved communities and communities that in some cases, at least in the past, government has not always been connected to or tuned into the needs of, again, the whole community. And so a part of this includes risk from natural and technological disasters, different hazard assessment methods, and again, a part of, and it's not required to read CPG 201. The Comprehensive Preparedness Guide, though, does take you through the steps of things that we do in writing plans or developing preparedness activities. The one thing that you will do that's related to preparedness activities this week will be, I think it's IS 230, and that's the Emergency Planning Independent Study course. It at least covers the basics of planning, just from a really topical standpoint. But THIRA is a four-step process. Again, from a whole community standpoint: identify threats and hazards, give threats and hazards context, establish capability targets, and apply the results. So that's kind of the four steps. And a part of this is, again, feeding this into the national preparedness goal. Let's give a couple of examples. And one, they use magnitude 6.8 earthquake, and then that is a threat. And then in the context of that is what's the description, the estimated impact, and the desired outcome. And the important part about the desired outcome, again, is to help us understand the description of threat, or understand how the hazard would impact us for not just the immediate impact, but the long-term impact. And certainly within 60 days, within 72 hours, again, those short windows into those long windows. And then core capabilities, this step 3, what's the capability targets? What should we do within 72 hours? What should we do within 5 days? And what are goals that we want to achieve? And I'm sure for this particular area, this was a part of their threat or hazard identification, was to look at a magnitude 6.8 earthquake. And then applying the results includes resource requirements, what types of resources may be available. Other aspects of the THIRA process falls over into strategic planning, the operational planning, and the mitigation activities. From a strategic planning, how do we think strategically to position resources to be able to respond to events such as this? Operational planning, how do we activate those resources and bring them in? And then mitigation activities, what types of things are either pre-positioned or what's been done to limit the damage or limit the exposure to the particular threat or hazard that was identified. And then other benefits include maybe exercise programs or training programs, but it's targeted activities either to communities or leaders with the intent of making them more aware of what may be at risk and what may be in play. So to take this and kind of move this into the plan, specifically as it relates to business continuity. So again, if you're going to operate a business, one of the most important things you can do is to be sure that you have, again, some basic continuity planning so that you can sustain your business during a disaster. And so that after a disaster, your business is able to quickly recover and quickly reopen. You know, no one wants a disaster to occur, but if it does, you know, if you think about the scene in Forrest Gump where his shrimp boat was the only shrimp boat that survived a hurricane. And as it turned out, he wound up being very successful in the shrimping business because of it. You know, again, you certainly don't wish any ill will on anyone, but it is important that you need to think strategically in terms of how do you plan for to survive a disaster? What types of systems do you put in place? What type of alternate supply chains may need to be available? What do you do in terms of shipping and getting your product out? If you're a walk-up store or a front-facing store, in terms of you have a public interface opportunity. You know, COVID right now has been an enormous hindrance to those small businesses that are front-facing, you know, with a direct public interface. And so, you know, it's driven a lot of people either online or it's driven a lot of people into bankruptcy. And so all of this is to remember crisis planning for any business includes how to sustain your business during the crisis so that when you come out on the other side, what you emerge from is a stronger, more opportunistic business. You know, one thing that I continue to hear people talk about is I want to get back to how things were. I don't know that that will ever happen. I think to some extent, whatever we were is not exactly going to be what we will be, and so that's a reflection of the fact of what we've learned from communicable disease. As I've mentioned before, you know, the flu this season has been almost non-existent. Well, it's not because the flu didn't have the same opportunity this year that it did in past years to spread from person to person. Just the difference is the same steps that you take to keep yourself safe in COVID-19, which is also just like the influenza, it's a communicable disease. And so the things that you did to keep yourself safe with COVID-19, which is a coronavirus, is the same thing that you would try to do to keep yourself safe with an influenza virus. And actually the influenza virus is not as contagious as the coronavirus COVID-19 was or is. So I think there will be some things that we take away from what we've learned about the last year. I mean, I still think we're going to wind up getting back to a lot of the things we used to do and a lot of the ways we used to do them. But there will be, I do think there will be steps that we take that don't allow us to really go back to exactly how things once were. Because I think we now understand how things once were can be quite dangerous, and particularly with something like COVID-19, not just dangerous, but deadly. And so again, as we go forward, we need to think about how we connect our staff, how we connect our supply chain, our critical equipment, and our utilities. All of those pieces feed into business continuity planning. And so, you know, why create a plan? That bottom line there is return to normalcy. Again, as I mentioned with COVID-19, I don't know what the new normal is going to look like, but I don't think it will look exactly like the old normal. And I do think that's because of what we've learned over the last year. Now, I may be completely wrong, but I think one of the things that we've learned over the last year is how much business we can do online. How much can you work from home? How much office space will be needed in the future? I think it will be a different look than it is today. How much, you know, how much online sales? If you have a small business, how much of an online presence did you develop during the pandemic, and how do you support those online sales going forward? I do believe that will be a part of that new normal, is how we look at those things. And then in investments, you know, one key investment is going to be shipping companies, because I think regardless of what's come out of this, one of the main takeaways has been how much we now rely on other people to move stuff from point A to point B, and with fewer customers coming in the door, and whether that stuff is fresh food or it's products being sold, again, it reminds us the importance of how we ship and how we ship things safely. What's the weight of our product that we're shipping? All of those things figure into our cost if we're the business owner, or profits if you're investing in a company that does shipping. Focus on the program, not just a plan. A plan is sometimes just a paper tiger. It needs to be more than that. It really needs to be a part of the philosophy of how you make a business work and how you make a business somewhat sustainable, because you know it has to be more than just trying to respond to the disaster. You have to look for ways that you can emerge from the disaster and emerge really in a stronger business model. You know, if we look at Lehman Brothers as an example, Lehman Brothers survived the American Civil War. It survived the Spanish-American War, World War I, the flu pandemic, the collapse of the economy in 1933, and World War II, but it didn't survive the 2008 financial collapse. And it's because at some point they got to the point where they had a lot of wrong answers and they invested poorly, and the company went bankrupt and left a lot of people who were once very wealthy not so very wealthy. And the whole point to that is, even the strongest companies, you know, if we went back 30 years, the most important business 30 years ago, 35 years ago, the most important business in the retail trade was probably Sears or Kmart. If we go back 30 years, the most important cell phone was a BlackBerry. And as technology has changed, what happened that those companies did not make changes necessary to be able to adapt to what was new that was going on. And in some cases it was financial disaster. In some cases it was kind of a host of technological developments. But more than anything else, it's important to think about how you develop a disaster plan so that you can sustain your business and survive to live another day and compete with something different. You know, if we look at the 4 key components in your business continuity plan, it really starts around critical equipment. What are you making, or what are you, again, I get back to your ice cream business. If you have machines that are mixing ice cream or making ice cream, it's certainly important that you have spare parts and the ability to repair that equipment. And certainly the supply chain, certainly the supply chain in terms of how you get the product in that you're going to need to make ice cream or whatever it is you make. And that could be vendors, what type of substitute products, is there political instability, any type of sudden price changes. And then utilities, again, I mentioned utilities earlier. I was talking about ice cream, but utilities can play into a lot of different things. The other thing that we saw, particularly during Hurricane Zeta here in New Orleans, was it substantially impacted cell towers for Verizon. And so in addition to losing your electricity, there were Verizon customers that were trying to rely on their cell phone for their internet connection, and it was not available to them. And they also had great difficulty sending text messages and receiving phone calls. Although I will tell you the lowest common denominator in terms of what needs the least amount of bandwidth to get a message out or receive a message is text message. You're more likely to get a text message out or receive a text message than you are to hit the internet or have a phone call, either receive or send. And then aside from utilities, so one other piece about utilities also in terms of gas, we've actually priced and considered buying a home generator that operates off of natural gas. Now, one of the things that I've tried to be sure that I've asked all of the vendors, most products that will work on natural gas will also work on propane, but not all of them. Understand, liquid propane is different than natural gas. So if you have gas operated machines, again, natural gas operated machines, and there was a risk of losing natural gas, could you have somebody bring in a LP tank and set it and connect it and allow you to stay in service? Something to think about. The only time I've been told that gas has not worked consistently in the New Orleans area was it was cut for a time during Hurricane Katrina. The rest of the time, gas has been functioning for about the last 20 years uninterrupted. Electricity, as I mentioned earlier, it's far more hit and miss because of the infrastructure challenges. And then phone, cable, and internet really depend on towers and what types of things you have available to you. And then staff roles, things to think about. Do you have remote work as an option? You know, one of the things the pandemic has taught us is how remote work can work. How can we work from home, and what are things that we really can't do from home, or at least shouldn't do from home? Do we allow cross-training so that people pick up additional job skills, so that if someone left the organization or did something different, how quickly could we get them replaced? I think during COVID-19, in some organizations, it's been very difficult to hire replacement people. So the fact that you do some cross-training or continuity of operations And we have an independent study course that we'll do later on related to continuity of ongoing operations. And then if necessary, do you have a devolution plan? Meaning if you have to spin down the business and close it, what is that plan other than a fire sale and moving on? So let's kind of wrap up with just a couple of things. The components of an emergency plan you need to do. I would encourage you to have an HVA. That at least helps you to understand what your potential hazards are. And then do you have some type of written procedure, and what type of resources do you have available? A trigger point, how do you activate your plan? And then key contact roster, how do you get in touch with people? Do you have both a primary contact and then another way to contact them, either a spouse or a significant other's cell phone, or what other means do you have of contacting key individuals within your organization? Do you have a way that you can notify your employees or vendors or anybody else that may need to either come to a certain site or leave a certain site? Have you identified employees with special skills? And I'll just give you one example. When we went to Mississippi and operated a field hospital for 2 months after Hurricane Katrina, we had 100 or so people who were all well-trained, extraordinary clinicians able to operate a hospital at a moment's notice. The three guys who really did as much, though, in the first 72 hours of the operation of our facility as we were setting it up were three paramedics who worked a part-time job as electricians. And they were able to use the electrical equipment that we had, including the generators, and tie it into, we actually set up in the parking lot of the Kmart there, where I think Walgreens is located now. And the light fixtures in the parking lot, they were able to connect the electrical power from the generators to those lights. And actually, which was very important in terms of lighting our compound or lighting our facility. But those special skills, whether it's plumbing, HVAC, electrical, who has those skills? And sometimes that's not their primary job, but their secondary job may be just as important. And so identifying who has those skills, or at least how do you have access to those skills? Let's see, let's kind of move to the end of this. And I don't mean to skip anything that's important. Certainly you can go through the slide presentation if you like, but I think one of the most important things is to, again, help you understand the planning process. It really starts with an HVA, and then how do you put your plan together, and then how do you involve other people in helping you develop a plan? Again, plans are really about processes and getting people involved and getting people engaged. Anybody can sit down and write a plan in a vacuum. I can sit down and write a really nice plan, but if I don't involve people, I don't know what they're capable of doing, and I also don't know what they understand. And until I have that conversation, and until they tell me, I'm just assuming things, and that's a really dangerous place to be when you're developing any type of a plan for your business or your organization. So let me wrap up with this. So again, in terms of are you prepared? Think about the preparedness process. Think about the planning process, but all of that really starts with, again, typically a hazards and vulnerability analysis. What type of hazards are out there, and then how vulnerable are you to those hazards? And then what are steps that you can take to mitigate your organization, to keep it prepared and to keep it safe? And whether you do that for your business or quite frankly, what's the really simple things that you do at home? are you prepared at home? And if not, what are the things that you're doing to be prepared at home? And with that, I don't have anything else to say. I only see one person online at the moment. Do you have any questions? And if not, I know I've gone through the assignments for this week, and let me look back on that one more time, but I think, actually, let me stop sharing that and then go back to sharing screen 3. Yeah, so the paper and 2 independent study courses are the things that are due this week. IS 138 or 139 and IS 235. IS 2101 I do not believe is available, so that assignment is not due and certainly won't be a part of this week's assignments. With that, I don't have anything else, so I appreciate your time, and thank you for watching. And as always, if you have questions, send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you next week on Zoom.
I appreciate it, Mr. Kearns.
You too.
What's in those boxes, Kyle?